Hey everyone, so today we've got a really fascinating explainer lined up for you. If you've ever found yourself wondering what's actually driving all these modern global conflicts, well, we're going to unpack some recent source material that offers a highly specific and, honestly, pretty provocative answer to exactly that. The source claims that current United States strategic thinking is essentially locked in a massive tug of war between two deeply opposed historical playbooks. One of them it calls the empire model, and the other the sovereignty model. And look, whether you agree with its conclusions or not, examining how this source structures its argument provides a super interesting look into the different ways geopolitical strategy is framed and debated today. We're going to break down their exact claims step by step. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll define these two policy playbooks. Then we'll look at the Iraq War framework, followed by the MacArthur and Iran strategy. After that, we'll hit perspectives on Ukraine, and finally, we'll wrap up with the future of global alliances. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Defining two policy playbooks. The core geopolitical divide.
All right, let's just dive right into this comparison. The source essentially drops all modern conflicts into one of two very distinct buckets. On one side, you've got what it calls the Empire Playbook. According to the material, this is basically all about endless, forever wars, driven mostly by a hunger for resource control and kept alive by intentionally stirring up sectarian division, like literally keeping local factions at each other's throats. But then on the flip side, you have the Sovereignty Playbook. The source frames this approach as being laser-focused on economic leverage. It's about fighting only when absolutely necessary for defense and focusing heavily on building actual conditions for peace rather than just perpetual occupation. So this binary framework is the exact lens through which the source views everything else we're going to talk about today.
Moving on to Section 2. The Iraq War framework. The Empire case study.
So, to actually build this case that Iraq was the ultimate imperial war, the source lays out this incredibly specific timeline of neoconservative policy. It kicks off back in 1992, pointing to a document by Paul Wolfowitz, who they describe as a protege of Middle East strategist Bernard Lewis. Now, this document basically argued for using the post-Soviet unipolar moment, that time of undisputed U.S. power, to launch preemptive regime changes. Fast forward a bit to 1996, and the timeline hits a document called Clean Break, which the source claims pushed Israel to totally ditch the land for peace idea and go all in on regional regime change starting with Iraq. Then, by 1997, the source highlights the Project for a New American Century, explicitly advocating for an Iraq war. And wrapping up this timeline, it cites General Wesley Clark, claiming that literally right after 9/11, the Pentagon was already drawing up regime change plans for 7 different Middle Eastern nations. So looking at this whole timeline, the source argues the Iraq War wasn't some spontaneous reaction at all. It was a long-planned strategic choice. Now, what I find really fascinating here is how the source defines the actual goals of this entire framework. It flat out claims that spreading democracy was just a cover story for a completely different agenda. The true goals, according to this narrative, total control over Middle East oil and gas and locking down the petrodollar system. To pull this off, the source argues the strategy leaned heavily on Bernard Lewis's theories, specifically exploiting sectarian division, pitting Sunni against Shia to keep the whole region fractured and, easier to manage. The ultimate endgame here, the source asserts, was to use a destabilized Iraq to kick off a massive domino effect of regime change across the entire Middle East, including Syria and Iran.
All right, on to Section 3, MacArthur and Iran strategy, the sovereignty case study.
So right at the heart of this sovereignty playbook is this idea of a necessary war. And the source defines this very specifically. It's not about a war of conquest, right? Instead, it's a conflict where a nation uses its overwhelming strategic and logistical might to create very specific conditions on the ground. The whole goal is to essentially box an enemy in, forcing them to accept a peaceful solution because it's literally the only viable alternative left, actively avoiding those massive, bloody, unnecessary battles. The source is very explicit about contrasting this tight, objective-driven approach with those sprawling, endless imperial wars we were just talking about. To really drive this point home, the source draws a direct historical parallel to General Douglas MacArthur's specific strategy during World War II, and the steps are pretty clear-cut. Step 1, isolate the enemy. Get total control of the air and sea around them. Step 2, bypass the unnecessary battles. The source points out that MacArthur didn't just throw away lives trying to take every single occupied island. He literally just skipped past the ones that didn't matter strategically. And then step 3, use that economic and logistical isolation so effectively that the enemy just has to sue for peace. The source argues that this is the classic historical blueprint for how necessary wars actually used to be fought, way before the whole shift to the empire model.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. The source takes this MacArthur framework and applies it directly to the current strategy toward Iran. It claims this strategy has one singular hyper-focused military goal: denying Iran a nuclear weapon. To pull that off, they're targeting only the nuclear threat and military infrastructure, trying to keep civilian casualties out of the equation. But honestly, here is the truly surprising part of this playbook: the economic pillar. The source argues there's actually a deliberate effort going on to keep Iran's civilian economy completely intact for its people's future, rather than just gutting the whole country. By being so selective with its strikes, the source claims this strategy has actually managed to completely remap regional alliances. It's lining up neighboring nations against the Iranian military threat, while ultimately working in favor of the United States. Which brings us to Section 4, Perspectives on Ukraine, the Old Order's Last Stand. Now, it's really important to flag here that the source presents a highly specific and, frankly, very strongly worded historical narrative about Ukraine. It drops this conflict entirely into that empire playbook bucket. According to the material, this war didn't just start recently. Actually, it claims it traces back to what it describes as a 2014 government overthrow, supposedly orchestrated by British and Obama administration interests. The source even goes so far as to claim the underlying motivation is this World War I-era strategic goal to conquer and basically loot Russia. It also asserts that covert, stay-behind elements, secretive operatives left in place to manipulate local politics, were used to spark a color revolution. All of this, the source argues, turned Ukraine into a permanent warfare platform aimed at forcing regime change in Russia. So again, just to be clear, this is how the source categorizes the conflict, as this desperate sort of final war of a globalist system that's just refusing to let go. And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, Future of Global Alliances. Defense economics and middle powers. So, the source starts highlighting this growing friction in global alliances, and it points to figures like Mark Carney. The material cites a viewpoint attributed to him, suggesting that so-called middle powers, like those in Europe, should actually band together to build their own defense alliance. But here's the kicker. The source notes this proposed alliance isn't just aimed at Russia or China. It's potentially positioned against the United States, using military buildup as a backdoor way to prop up struggling European economies. The source basically frames this as the empire faction, scrambling to keep themselves relevant on the global stage. And this sets up a brilliant counter-argument from the source material. It highlights a public rebuttal from Eldridge Colby aimed squarely at this whole middle power strategy. Colby just bluntly states that no alternative country or even a coalition of countries can even come close to competing with the United States defense industrial base, not in quantity and definitely not in quality. The source uses Colby's quote to basically say, look, there is simply no credible alternative to American industrial and technological supremacy. It frames this as a really hard reality check for any nation still clinging to that old globalist empire model. To really emphasize this massive shift toward the sovereignty model, the source points to a huge economic pivot, specifically the decision to replace a 20% United States military reimbursement fee that was previously charged to allies. Instead of just collecting that fee, the new strategy involves negotiating these massive trade and investment deals, where Gulf states are essentially pouring capital directly into the U.S. The source argues this is going to result in historic levels of factories, plants, and equipment being built domestically, creating literally millions of jobs. And this is presented as the ultimate endgame of the sovereignty playbook, right? Fighting wars not just to feed an empire, but to actually win peace and aggressively rebuild domestic economic strength. All right, bringing this all together, we can really clearly see how this thesis categorizes things. Looking at the breakdown, the Iraq conflict gets labeled strictly under the empire playbook, right? With its primary goals being resource control and endless war. Then you have the current Iran strategy, which falls under the sovereignty playbook, prioritizing that focused nuclear denial and national defense, without all the unnecessary occupation. And finally, the war in Ukraine gets categorized as the old order, with the source asserting its main goal is just preserving a failing globalist system. It is a really stark, highly structured way of viewing modern history. Which brings us to our final slide today and a pretty crucial question for you all to think about. The source we just examined heavily relies on these historical lenses, comparing modern strategies to the Roman Empire's sectarian tactics on one hand and Douglas MacArthur's strategic isolation on the other. So how do these historical frameworks shape, or maybe even distort, our understanding of modern geopolitical conflicts? Does taking the present and mapping it onto the past actually clarify the motives of world leaders for us, or does it just oversimplify incredibly complex modern realities? It's definitely a question worth asking yourself the next time you're scrolling through the headlines. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating source material, and as always, keep questioning the frameworks presented to you.